Hello Mappers! Today's tutorial I'm going to talk about the in-game materials editor for Quake2World. This is brand new, we just added this today actually. What it allows you to do is define all of the per pixel lighting properties for every texture in your map without having to jump back and forth between a text editor and reloading your level constantly. So the goal here was to speed up the materials definition process and to make it less error prone and overall more convenient, and hopefully ultimately produce better looking maps as well. So without further ado, I've loaded up a map here, Torn Glory. You've all seen this map before. I've also gone in ahead of time and kind of messed with the materials file to make it look terrible, and you can see it does. So how do we go about fixing that? Well, to activate the in-game editor, you just bring down the console and type clEditor 1. And once you do that, the in-game menus then become this editor dialog, and every time I hit escape and then come back to the menu, I'm presented with the editor again. So the way that I select a texture to edit the properties of it is to actually just point the crosshair over it. So let's start with this trim that looks terrible and hit escape. And it's selected the texture for me. The name of the texture is Metal Glue, and it's telling me that it's currently using the normal map named Metal Glue _NM. The per pixel lighting properties, these are the 4 things that you would typically define for every single material in the map in your .mat file, which is a text file that obviously lives outside of the BSP. So you have bump map, hardness, specularity, and parallax offset. To tune these, you have this radial slider widget, and the values are clamped to what are pretty sane defaults for the engine. So if you have a really strange set of normal maps, or you want to make a really bizarre effect on your textures, you could always go into the text file and edit them and override these values to beyond what the limits in the editor provide. But the editor itself clamps everything between 0.1 and 20 for all of these fields. So the bump map, when I loaded this, it was way up at 20 for this trim. And as I start to dial it down with the radial slider here, you'll see that the texture begins to change. You'll notice that it looks less and less like white noise and more like metal, which is what we're going for. So at some point, maybe right around there, 2.1, it looks pretty reasonable. We've taken all the noise out of the texture. And we can actually take a look at the texture from a different angle to see if we're really happy with what we did there. It's certainly better, but it's still got a little ways to go. So we'll just fine-tune it by clicking these buttons. And we'll bring it down to 0.8. That looks pretty good. And the hardness factor determines how much light the surface reflects, essentially. This should be a reflective texture, but it's not like a highly polished surface that would necessarily look glossy. So we're going to knock this down as well, just a bit. Maybe to about there. And then the specular highlights for this probably look about right where they're at right now. The parallax offset I will get to in a moment with a different texture that has a better height map baked into its normal map than this one does. So there, rather than go back and forth between a text editor and try umpteen different values and reload the map 12 times, we were able to completely tune this material without leaving the game at all. And we'll look at the texture right next to it now. This is supposed to be a smooth but highly reflective texture with some significant parallax bevels between these panels here. And it's a little bit off right now. It's not terrible, but it could look better. So let's play with this one some. So the name of this texture is MetPan, and it's telling me the bump is set at 2.0, which is probably why it looks a little bit noisier than we'd like. So if we back this down to 1.0, we get rid of some of the noise that you noticed in this particular area. And the hardness of 6 is probably pretty close to where we want. This is, again, supposed to be a very reflective texture, so let's crank this up to maybe 8. And you'll notice the texture became a bit brighter when we did that. It didn't actually become terribly bright because the specularity for this is almost off the charts. So let's drop that down, and we should actually see this texture lighten up significantly. There we go. So now we're getting a nice strong reflection off of this texture. The reflection follows the light source that's beneath the texture there, and also the light source, the larger, stronger light source that's above it. And this is about how we would expect that material to behave in real life. So we're pretty close to done here. The last thing I'll show you is the parallax offset tuning. So what this actually does is it provides these perspective correct bevels that you see between the panels here, and that's done by using a height map. And essentially all parallax does is it samples the texture at a slightly different offset, and that offset is determined by your eye position, or the camera position. So to tune that, if you crank this way up, you'll notice that to an extent it starts to look more and more 3D, but you also get these strange artifacts because what's really happening is you're shifting the texture, and so there's only so much play you really have with this effect before it just starts to not look good. You have this little red indicator on the radial widget too, which is nice to show you where you were at. So I'm going above it, or I'm going below where I was previously at. But you can see the bevels go away as I bring this down to 0, and the bevels get really, really steep as I bring this higher. If you have really high resolution normal maps and really high resolution textures, and you have great quality height maps, you can actually crank this all the way up to about 6 or 7 and get some really, really eye-popping bum maps going on. But for this particular texture, it is what it is, and so I think we're going to be able to, or we're only going to be able to squeak out about 2 before we start to introduce those funny edges on that. Maybe about 2.3 is about as high as we can go. So there, we've now fixed 3 textures, or 2 actually, just 2, getting ahead of myself. That's that. That's the in-game materials editor. So once you've gone through your entire level and tuned all the materials, quite a few more here are messed up, and I would have to go through them one by one. But once I've done that, and I'm at a good place, the editor has a save button here, and this will, if I click it, it saves the materials file itself to a file on your hard drive. It doesn't overwrite the one that was previously there, so if you have things like texture animations and other stages defined in your materials file, you're not going to lose those by clicking save here. It writes a brand new materials file with an incremental file name extension. So this one would be torn-000.mat, and the next time I click save, it would write torn-001.mat. So when you exit the game, you can go and open whichever snapshot of the materials you're happiest with in your text editor and merge it with the main file. If you do this as one of the first steps in creating your materials file for your map, then you won't have to worry about doing any merging. You can just copy this and paste it right over the original file, and you'll be done. So that's the in-game materials editor. I hope mappers out there find this useful, and that's all for now. Thanks a lot.